Hi there. Today I'm going to show you how we can improve performance by using batching and caching with the JavaScript promises. So here I do have a Node application and I'm using here Express to create um, APIs or endpoints. So here I do have an endpoint with this path, which is test, and it accepts like a parameter or an ID, and then I'm just like returning the results back to the user. To make things simple and easy, I created like a service here, a service with E. Okay, so I created a service that will simulate this call. So let's take a look at this service. So this file is my service. So we can see I do have here a function called getResult. GetResult, which is get exposed or exported and used by that endpoint. And getResult will call another function which is called getDataMock. And here's getDataMock, which basically it accepts also an ID and a callback. Same signature for this function. And then I'm creating here a set timeout to just simulate that this method is in an asynchronous method or an asynchronous function. So I'm using a module here called sleep to simulate delay, which is here in this case 200 millisecond. So every time this function being called, it will simulate, at least it will take 200 millisecond to respond back, in addition to the 200 millisecond here to make it asynchronous. So let's say it will take around 400 millisecond. And then you can see I'm creating an object passing the same ID. Here I'm using like the ES6. So this I will end up with a property called ID that will take the value of this ID, and with another property called data, with this data like array of data, which is result 1, result 2, result 3, and I'm just logging every time this function being called. It will be logged here. And the last thing is that the callback that I pass here will be called. The error will always be null, and the result will be the object, which is the response, which is the node style callback styles. So I'll go back again here to this endpoint. This is my endpoint, and again, the way I call it, this one is a slow endpoint, and I'm going to show you why. So if I just run this one, I'm listening on this port. Let's first curl this. Same port, test. Let's, for example, here I'm passing the ID of, give me the ID of 5. I will get this JSON response of the ID of 5 and the data. For example, if I said 7, I'll get the ID of 7 and this data. So you can see here the logs, which is for request. I made a request for the endpoint, and then I made a call to the database, for example, with that same ID. One's for the 5 and the other one for the 7. Now let's load test this endpoint. What I mean by that is I'm going to simulate that I'm making like 3 users making this concurrent request for this endpoint at the same time. For that purpose, I will use the Apache bench. For example, here in Linux, I'm using Linux, so I've just installed it as part of the Apache 2 util package. So the way to do it is Apache bench 3 concurrent with 3 users, and then the address, with this ID. Let's see what will happen. Okay, so we can see for these 3 requests, concurrent requests, the total time is around 800 milliseconds. The reason why it's taking all of this time is that for each request, although these 3 requests here happened at the same time for the same value, I end up calling the database 3 times for that same ID. So the first thing that comes to mind is to improve this time is, if you think about it, is that I'm using the same ID here. So when I have 3 users hitting this endpoint at the same time, instead of for that same ID, instead of calling the database 3 times, I just can call the first one for the first request, and then the others who can just listen to this can get the data from that first request instead of calling the database again and again and again. So the way to do it is to batch these requests together. So in this case, what I can do is, I'm not going to give the full solution for this one because I don't want to use callbacks. I want to use promises. But let me just give you a hint. Is I can create, for example, a queue, and this queue is just an object, and then here, instead of calling the getDataMock with the ID, I can just say, first, when I get the request for this ID, I just can say queue of that ID equal the callback I received. So here I create, just for this ID, I'm creating a new array with the callback that I received, and then here what I can do is I can since this one is accepting an error and a result, I can go, for example, here I can say the my queue of that specific ID, go ahead and for each callback there, go ahead and call this callback with, for example, the error and the result. And I can just say here, delete that. So here what I'm doing is I created a queue. Every time this function is being called for a specific ID, I will assign this callback, and I will push this callback inside an array. So if this one has a value, for example, if my queue with that specific ID is already there, what I can do, I just can say return ID and just push this callback. So here I'm simulating the batching. For this queue with that specific ID, so if it's already there, if the queue already have this ID, which means this function has been called with that specific ID, I'm not going to go and call the database. I'm just going to push this callback inside my queue. And then when this my database, only the first time, I will just assign this, I will add this ID to my queue and add the first callback just to create an array. And then when I receive the data from this second function in a synchronous way, which is, as I mentioned, just a mock, I will go ahead and for each callback I do have in my queue, I'll go and call my callback again and again with the result. And then when I'm finished, I just can delete this from my queue. Basically, with this way, I created a batch. But I'm not interested to do this way because for caching, I also need to create another object with cache, and then instead of go back and call the add it to the queue, or call the database again, I can just call the cache and get the result from the cache. Standard way. I'm interested to create this using promises. Let me clean this up and return to the original state. Okay. Let me first talk about what's promises, just briefly. So this is the way how you can create promises in ECMAScript 2015 or ES6. So the way is it's just like create a new promise, and this promise will receive a function with resolve and reject. And if everything is done successfully and you received your value, you can just call resolve and pass the value back. Or if something goes wrong, then you can say hey, reject. So this is basically the promise. P is a promise. Now if you just say p.then and you pass another function with some value here and do some work here with the value. So this is the first feature, is that whichever function that attached to then, it will be called after this promise has been resolved. And for the reject, it's either you can pass another function here, which will be called if this promise has been rejected, or even you can create a catch, global catch for this catch keyword for this promise, and then also would catch the error or the rejection of this promise. So this is the first feature. Second thing is that resolve or reject will always cause this function here that's passed to then to be called asynchronously, because it will add it to a different job queue. So that the second thing is that always this one will be this function will be called asynchronously. Another thing is that you can attach as many thens as you like. So if you say it this way, then you are guaranteed that each function of these then will be called whenever this promise has been resolved, one after the other. So the first thing, this one will be called, then the second one, then the third one, and so on. And you can attach then even after this promise has been resolved. So what I'm saying is that imagine that your promise here, all of these thens will be, all of these functions that attach to the current then will be called after the promise has been resolved. But even if this promise has been resolved and you attach the then to it, then it will not go and make another call for resolve. No, you will get the result back to this then. So for example, if you have here a set timeout and you have some function here, just like simulating some asynchronous job, and you say p.then, or yeah, p.then, then even if this one has been resolved, you will not make another call to the work here you've done and you cause resolve. No, you will, if this has been resolved, you can still attach thens to the promise, and you are guaranteed that the function here will be called again. And another thing is that every then will always return another promise. So you can say dot then, pass the same code, and then dot then. So you can chain promises because every then return another promise. So let's keep this in mind. Let me go ahead and start refactor my code to reflect this. So in this case, let me create a new version of this function that will return a promise. So I will say const get data, for example, promise mock, and this one, it will accept the ID. So it will return a new promise that, as I mentioned, it will take resolve, a function with a resolve, and reject. Here I just can call the original get data mock, in case there's an error or a result. So I'm assuming there's no error. I'll just say resolve my result. So now this function here will return a promise. So you can assume that I promisfied my original function, or I created a new version of my original function that go and call the database or make another request to another endpoint or wherever, and make this return a promise instead. It's simple. So I'm creating a new promise, passing the resolve and reject, and then I'm calling the original one here, which accepts the ID, and in case another function or the callback in case there's an error or result, and let's assume there is no error whatsoever. So I'm resolving this with the result. Let's add these semicolons. So this is my new version. So the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going also to create a new version, a new service that will use the Promise version. So say get result it will also accept an ID. So this function will go ahead and just return, or instead of return we just say, so in this case I will create, let's create our queue, which is also an object. And for this queue, what I will do is if so I'll just say if this ID has been called for the first time, I will create this queue with that ID equal passing the same ID. So this function will return me a promise, which means I can call then here, or instead of calling then I'll just say this, and then I can say queue dot then queue of this specific ID dot then. Here I'll pass another function which will get the result. So when this promise is being resolved, this function will be called. So here I can say, so for example, let's assume that this function will also get a callback just to keep my original endpoint consistent. So instead of this, I just can go ahead and call the callback. So this callback that I received, it will be called whenever the original promise has been resolved, and it will pass the result to it. So if I do have this value here, then I don't need to make another trip and call my promise function again. I can just say queue of that ID dot then. To make sure that my code stop here, just say return that. So same idea, I created a queue. If this queue has been called before or have the ID, then it will just attach another than with this callback. If it's first time, then I'm creating this value, and then I am creating like this property, or this ID will be a property of this object, and it will be a promise. So I will attach the then here to with the callback that I have been received. think here I need to. That's it. Let's save this. Let's make sure I did not make any other mistake. I'll go back to the endpoint. What I will do here, I will create a new version of it, of this one, and I will call this one as batch. So it had, instead of going and refactoring this one, I will keep the slow version, and I will create a new version of it just to see the difference when I load test it again, if there's an improvement or not. So this one has a different signature, which is batch, and the same ID. Same thing, I'll keep the log here. So I will need to expose this function, which is called getResultBatch. So here I'm using ES6, which is also equal to getResult, for example, in the older versions of, for example, in ES5. So I'm exposing these two functions. From here I can say, instead of getResult, I think it's getResultBatch, and same thing, but since I'm using Promise, instead of passing the error, I just say the result here. So this function will be called whenever the promise has been resolved. I'll get the result, return back to the user. So this is my new endpoint. Now I need to restart my server. Same port. Let's clear this one. Let's say curl same port. This time is batch, and for example for 5. Let's see what will happen. Nothing. Something's wrong here. Okay, I did not save this file. Let me clear it first. Request the second one. Okay. So now I received the result as expected. Now let's make another call. I also received a result, but the interesting part here is that I did not make another call to the database. So the first request, I made a call to the database, as you can see here. The second request, I did not, because I got that from the queue. So now if I made another call, same thing, I'm receiving the result, but I'm not calling the database again, which is a good improvement over the previous version. But usually here I need to clean my data. For example, I don't want to keep the problem here right now is that this queue with the ID will have the same promise forever. So I need to clean this one. So just to make this one more consistent, I will rename it to be called cache, because here I'm going to combine caching and batching on the same step. So So here I renamed this one to be a cache because I want here the first is like the promise is being cached in this object. So what I need to do is I need to clean up this cache after some time. The way to do it is just attach another than here and passing another function. And then, okay, let me clean this up. Here what I can do is I can create a set timeout, which also will receive another function, and here I can just say delete clean up the cache after, for example, let's say 2 seconds. So here I'm combining batching and caching on the same step because of the features that promises provide for me. As you can see, it's in addition it's really clean. It's also easier to implement rather than using callbacks. So here the first time if my cache doesn't have this ID, I'll go ahead and call the if it has this ID, I will go ahead and call this promise and attach the callback to the then. Otherwise, I will go and call the promise, and then for the first request, I will just attach this, and then attach another then, so that after 2 seconds, this code will be implemented. This code here, which is will go and delete this property from this object after 2 seconds. Now let's save this. Let me go and clean this. Now, so I made 2 requests quickly. So you can see the first request went and called the database, the second one did not. Third one, it went and called the database because at that time the cache has been cleaned, so that ID does not exist anymore. Now let's see the difference when I make the Apache bench call again. So I will call the first version of it, which is the test version, just to compare the times. And with 3 users, concurrent users, the time consumed is around 800 milliseconds. Now let's try our improved version, which is the batch. You can see it's like we improved our performance to half. So here, if I, for example, increase the number of users to 5, same time. Which is like around 400 milliseconds, while if I increase this number of users for the test one, oh wow, it's over a second. So you can see the improvement that I get with the with the batching and caching with the promises. And just to make things more interesting, I will try to use a different loading mechanism, because with Apache Bench I'm just loading this endpoint with the same value over and over again. But in real life, let's say when you have like a busy website or a busy endpoint, you will have users hitting your endpoint with different values each time. So let's see the performance that I get. So for that, I will use a different tool, and you can see I have created like here a file with this different values. So for example, my endpoint will have different IDs, 2, 7, and 9, and the tool is called Siege. So I can say, since I have it here, I will use can say Siege. It will accept my URLs, and it will accept the repetition, which is, let's say, 5, and then the concurrent, which is also 5, and that's it. So basically this tool, it will go and call this endpoint, and with this amount of concurrent users and the repetition I do have, and I can pass the D to be 1 millisecond or 1 second in this case. Let's see. So my older version, the time for this 25 hits, you can see here it's simulating like calling different IDs concurrently, which is kind of like similar to real life. It took around like 7 seconds, with the longest request around 1 second and the shortest one around 40. So this is my older version. Now I will create a new one, and call this the batch. So this is my new version, which should be faster than the original one. And let me make the same test, this time using the second URLs. Okay, so we can see now we have a better performance. With this 25 hits with different IDs, the total time took 4 seconds. With the longest transaction is 400 milliseconds, and the shortest one around 0. You can see like the huge amount of performance that we gained by just refactoring our code simply to use batching and caching with the elegance of promises. So I hope this tutorial has been useful, and yeah, thank you.